Hi, everybody. Welcome to We Didn't Turn Out Okay. Today, I'm so honored and excited to have on Emily Oster, renowned economist, bestselling author, and truly such a trusted voice in the parenting space with research and evidence-based practices and data. Can you introduce yourself, Emily, and tell us about you both as a professional and as a mom?
Of course. So thank you so much for having me. My name's Emily. I am a professor of economics at Brown University. I'm the founder and CEO of Parent Data, which is an online platform with data-based information about pregnancy and parenting. I have 4 books: Expecting Better, Cribsheet, The Family Firm, and The Unexpected. And I am a mom. I have 2 kids who are 14 and 10.
Maybe not on the other side, but like a little bit into the next
It is.
phase.
It's very interesting to. Much of my audience has kind of little kids,
Yes.
and so having older kids is easier in many ways. Like people poop in the toilet by themselves, like they get their own jackets. But then of course it is actually harder in some ways. So it provides a nice perspective,
Yeah.
to be able to sort of come back and say, hey, remember what it was like when they were 3, and then also be
Right.
like, one day things will be different.
Totally.
You will not be so tired.
Yes. And I'm sure we'll weave all of that in because I really want that insight of like what's ahead. But I want to share an anecdote of how I found you, just because you kind of mentioned that a lot of your audience is, pre-pregnancy and parents of younger kids. I found Emily when I was thinking of trying to have a baby. And it took me a while. I was going through IVF, so I had kind of time to plan what that meant in all areas, including my mental health. I had been on an SSRI of some sort and Zoloft at the time since I was 17. And in my mind, it was like, no, I'm just not going to be on it.
Yeah.
But then with IVF and just sort of the whole thing, I was like, I don't know what will be better not being on it and maybe going through stress. And everyone during IVF is like, just don't be stressed, calm down. Anyway, I knew that, my doctors were like, try to stay calm and let things happen. And that was just virtually impossible, especially if I was not going to be on my anxiety medication. So you came up for me, not through social media, through Google. And then, there's many nuances around it. But anyway, I just knew right then that you were a source for mental ease for me.
It's amazing.
And not just because I liked what you had to say, but because you knew what you were talking about. So I want to ask you, besides that you are, I don't want to say like a data nerd. I feel like
No, that's
not
fine.
at all. Just more.
Yeah,
nerd. I love nerds.
That's a compliment.
Yeah,
Yeah, totally.
You're like
I will
passionate
own that.
about
I'll own that. I love data.
But it felt like you didn't. Basically, did you feel like I don't want to speak to anyone unless I have the backing? Like, what made you feel like that was so important? Besides the obvious, just
So I started doing this work like for myself.
for yourself.
Right? So I got pregnant with my daughter, who is now 14, and this sort of experience was not what I expected. Not so much because the pregnancy wasn't what I expected, but like the way that I was interacting with the advice I was getting was not what it wasn't coming to me with data. It wasn't coming to me with
Right.
like, here is how to think about this decision. I would say even more than data. Like I am very committed to the idea that when we have a decision like, should I stay on my Zoloft, while I'm going through IVF, or, should I have an epidural, or should I have this kind of prenatal testing, or should I eat sushi? Like all of these things should be framed as, here's the decision you have, and like, here's the evidence, and here's how you should think about this decision. And instead, so much of pregnancy was just do this, don't do this.
Right. Because that's what we've been told. Yeah.
And that is like, that didn't work for me. And so that was really where I started, was trying to figure that stuff out for myself. And then, thinking about, how can I explain this to other people, because I feel like this experience it could be better.
Right. And you probably realize also, like, we're all just kind of taking this at face value, besides you, and really saw this void in just where else can we kind of get information to back the information we're given, right?
Yeah, I mean, I got pregnant I was like 30. And so everyone, like a lot of my friends were getting pregnant around the same time. And I think the thing that pushed me from, I'm just going to do this for myself to, well, maybe I can do this for other people is the number of questions that were, not exactly my question, but a similar set of, oh, I was diagnosed with like placenta previa, like what does that mean? How should do I really need to be on pelvic rest? Like people had so many
Yeah.
different questions, and they also wanted to explore those questions in the same way that I did, and they were not being met with it. So it sort of felt like maybe I'm not the only person with this desire to approach their
Yes.
pregnancy in this way.
I mean, I think if you even look at the course of how information has kind of been presented and digested, I think it's taken that course, right? When there was this oversaturation, as social media picked up and more information
Yeah.
came out throughout the last like 10 years, it was like, who am I supposed to trust and follow? And I think people were craving, okay, I want like the science and the data behind anything. And what's amazing to me is you were kind of ahead of that for your own self.
Yes, this is like almost 15 years ago, and so
Yeah,
it was.
it's
I think
incredible.
I was ahead of the desire for the science.
Right. And that you had the motivation to do it. I think for me, it's just like, okay, it's so overwhelming. I need someone to, which what you've done, present it. And I love that you couldn't find that. So you're like, I need to do
Yeah,
it.
I think it was. I think I brought to it both a desire to do this, and then the particular thing that I think I do fairly well is kind of how to take all of this as really like this is my job. I'm a professor. Like I have a PhD in things about statistics, and to sort of take all of that data and then figure out like how can I help people engage with the data, even though they are not. They do not have a PhD
Right.
in economics or statistics or whatever it is, and that part for me is the most interesting and sort of fun part of it is how do I give people the information to use in their own decision making rather than assume like, well, because you don't have a doctoral degree or a medical
Correct.
degree, like you're not going to be able to engage with this question, which is where I think a lot of people were coming initially. Like, I'm going to tell you what to do because you're not a doctor, as opposed to saying people want to think about this stuff for themselves
Yes.
and they should play a role in the decision making. We need to give them the tools to do
Right.
that.
They don't know where to start. And I guess it's sort of like an obvious question when I'm like, what made you do this? Like, you did have your PhD and were interested in this. And so where does that come from? Like, I'm sure you didn't imagine when you went to school and became passionate about this, that this is the course it would take.
Right.
Can you think, like, were you always interested in that? Was it always like math or data? Yeah.
So I've always really liked data, even as like a little kid. Um, which is unusual. But when I got a PhD, I did not like when you get a PhD, like you're going to be a professor, and like being
Right.
a professor is a particular activity, and it's not the activity that I do now. It's not this, right?
Yeah.
But the piece that I had always really liked was sort of communicating to a broader audience, whether that was a sort of broader lay audience or whether it was students. I mean, basically, this is the same as teaching.
I was
Like,
just going to
it's
say, you are
very,
a
very,
professor for all
very
of us.
similar set of activities. And once I started writing these books, I realized how much I liked that activity and, potentially how much value I could bring to the world outside of the kinds of value that I bring as an academic. And so it's sort of, I don't know, I feel like as we age, we kind of like try to figure out like what is the best use of our
Yes.
whatever weird talents we have. And
Yes.
like, this is probably the better use of my talents than writing papers, even though some of my papers are fine.
Right. And probably are now your books, right? Like in different shapes and forms,
Exactly.
right? And what's amazing to me about what you do is that, it doesn't just fall into one space, right? Like, could you argue that you could take this to any? You've chosen to do parenting and pregnancy and all of that.
Yes, I think many of the issues that I try to address in pregnancy, like, what does the best data say about this decision or about this, relationship we're seeing in the data, that is the same kinds of questions you could ask about many other spaces. I write some about kind of what we think of as more of like a wellness space.
Yeah.
But really, like, my view is, data and decision making is this is how you should run your whole life. And it's
I'm
all the time.
This is why I'm so excited to have you on, because it is literally the antithesis of what I can wrap my head around. Like, I'm just more of this, like, creative, like I said to you, you know, it's too overwhelming to me. I'm like not a math person. I wish I were more, but it's also why I have notes for you, because I feel like you can take your knowledge in a bunch of different topics, or I'm sure you have when it relates to parenting. And so I was like, there's so much I want to ask her. And I know that my listeners will want to, you know the same things that probably are on top of mind for me. For me, what feels most top of mind, as we were just touching on, just the trajectory of social media and
Yeah.
technology and things like that, while that can be so positive, as my girls are now 5 and 7. So they're not quite there yet, but I would love to hear from you how you feel about technology in parenting and what you've done with your own children.
Yeah, so I think I would sort of separate two different technology questions. I think sometimes we sort of talk about tech
Yeah.
and screen time as like one thing. And I think actually for littler kids, this problem isn't maybe as difficult. So when we talk about like little kids and their consumption of passive screen time, you know, like how much should I let my kids, you know, watch Miss Rachel or
Right.
whatever it is. There, I think the right way for parents to think about it is just, you know, that time is time that's not spent on something else. And, you know, there are some things you really want in your kids' life every day. You know, enough sleep, going to school, doing their homework if they have homework, like spending
Right.
some time with your family, going outside. You know, some like core things that we know contribute positively to kids. If the TV is instead of all of those things, like that's too much. If your
Right.
kid is watching 8 hours of TV a day, they're not going to have time to do the things that they should be doing. But there is nothing inherently bad about some screen time, and sort of mostly parents should just think about like, where does it fit in my life? You know, where is
Right.
the time? What are the boundaries we're going to set? And then hold the boundaries. And I'm not suggesting that's easy to do.
Right.
It's very hard to hold the boundaries with your kids, but the idea of what you should do and how to structure it, I think that's pretty straightforward. Then we get to like phones and social media.
Right.
And that is a much more challenging conversation, partly because I think we've gotten to a kind of a weird space on it where people think like where people are very engaged with the idea that like I'm going to not give it to them until some age, or there's going to be a point at which then we'll give it
Right.
to them and then it'll be over. And so there's something valuable to the waiting idea, but it's almost not enough. Like I don't think
Right.
I think really what we need to recognize is when your kid is 20 or 18, they are going to have a phone and they're going to have access to whatever social media, you know, there is, and they're going to be able to make their own choices. Your job as a parent is to teach them to make those choices well. And teaching them to make those choices well involves putting some boundaries, but also like letting them experiment within those boundaries. And that's the piece that's really hard. And so when people say, you know, well, is it a good idea to withhold the phone until they're
It's
in
not
8th
that
grade?
easy.
Like, sure, that's fine, but it's not like then when you give them their phone in
Right.
8th grade, you're like, enjoy.
Correct.
See you as an adult. You know, like
Yeah.
your job is to say, okay, you're going to get a phone. Let's talk about what restrictions we're going to put on it. Let's, you know, talk about like what we're going to do if you violate those restrictions. Like, so I'll give you an example. I talked to somebody at some point who was like, well, you know, we weren't going to give my kid a phone and then we did. And then we told them they couldn't have Instagram and then they got it. And then, you know, we told them they couldn't have a public account and then they got a public account. And like now, you know, what are we going to do? And I think there's points like, take the phone away. Like, you know, and I think it's like, it's not that that's easy to do, but I think
Right.
up front, like
Yeah.
the goal with social media should be, and with phones, with social media, with whatever is this next phase, is to figure out like, where am I going to draw the boundaries and how am I going to help you learn to use this in a way that serves you?
Yeah.
And the thing that's winning is if our kids are putting their own restrictions on, right? And that's just like a lot of work to help your kid figure out how am I interacting with the phone. Because the reality of the data is that some kids really benefit from social media. For some kids is actually really great, like can be really helpful for mental health. And some kids really don't benefit.
Right.
Probably on average, it's negative, but you know, it varies a lot across people. There's no substitute for learning about your own kid, for the kid learning about themselves.
Right.
That just involves time.
Yeah. I was going to say, like, I love what you said, but when the kids are kind of, I guess, setting their own boundaries around it, right? That probably, it comes from years before, right?
Yes.
Like building this internal voice.
Totally.
And a lot of you're always enough, you know, in different shapes and forms because there's going to be the like it's huge.
But it's the same skills. There's so many of these skills that we have the opportunity to build with our kids. Like another one I think about a lot is sleep. So like
Yeah.
sleep is really important. And when our kids are little, like we just tell them when to go to sleep. Then they don't always do it, but like that's
Right.
the idea. But as they age, they are going to have more control over their own sleep. But they really need to sleep probably more than they think that they do. So like how can we help our kids figure out the value of sleep for themselves?
Yeah.
So when they are out of our like look, your job as a
that's the
parent is
goal.
to figure out when your kid is out of your house, like how are they going to make good choices?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
they can't do that if you have made all of the choices for them.
Right.
Right?
Like it's less about as when, you know, circling back to just technology as an example of this bigger topic, you know, it's less about at these certain ages, but it's like I think those ages represent, to me personally, when I feel like they can make more of these decisions more practically. Like initially, when I became a mom, I'm like, no iPad, like at all. Like I was literally, I
Sure.
mean, I didn't shame anybody. I never do. But for me, I was like, it's such a slippery slope. Like you said, I
Yep.
don't want to sacrifice other things. But then I also realized how dangerous that is, right? Like withholding and making it this like negative thing.
Yep.
It's like the kid who never had junk food and then like ran to my house because we
Right.
always did, and I
Totally.
just saw that. And so I felt like, you know, I introduced it this year at 5 and 7. I can have conversations with them around it about like if we're on the iPad, then we're missing out on other things. So taking that into consideration when it comes to sleep and these other topics, you have kids that are older. Have you felt similarly that it's like when you can have these conversations?
I do. I think there's a lot of like when you can have these conversations. I think as your kids get bigger, out of your kids' ages, but
Yeah.
as you sort of start to thinking about a teenager, I think there's like a couple of things I would keep in mind. So one is like even though your teenager seems like an adult and they talk like an
Yes.
adult and they think they're an adult, they're not.
Yeah.
And so, you know, sometimes, I mean, a phrase I use frequently with my kids, it's not always well received, is like, I have a fully developed frontal lobe and I need to be some of your frontal lobe for now. This is like not well received, but it's true.
No,
like
I love
there's a long time where you still need to be part of their frontal lobe, even though they are like it's harder for them to see that. So yes,
Right.
absolutely, they're more engaged and they are not an adult. I think the other thing is even if it's an adult, if there's something they have not done before, then you would teach, right?
Right.
Like there's a reason we wait till kids are 16 to let them drive. And that is because of, you know, various decision-making things and so on. But we're not just like, here are your car keys.
Right.
Like you're 16, we teach them how to drive. And for many of these other things, like managing your life, running your, whatever it is, like that's also part of the job is to teach them how to do it themselves.
Yes. I was smiling, of course, because it was funny when you talked about the frontal lobe thing. I picture your kids being like, Mom, not the frontal lobe.
Oh, yeah, the
Spiel again.
worst thing is the running. Actually, even worse than my frontal lobe thing are the number of times that I try to explain, like, pushing yourself and, like, how to manage your emotions through the example of running. My daughter was like, don't bring that up anymore.
I want to hear it
like,
now.
I'll just be like, you know, run the lap you're in. Like, you know, at mile 24, you're really tired, but you have to push through. She's like, oh, my God.
Enough with the
Stop
running
it with
metaphor.
this. Like, this
Are
is
you a
enough.
runner?
Yes. No, it's just like I
Oh
have
my
so much. I
God.
have so much like life advice based on like marathon distances,
I
and they're
mean,
just like, "Stop this!
it makes
This is not helping.
sense.
You're a crazy nut job."
Right. Oh my God. I love that though. And like that it's meaningful to you, right? It's stuff that
It's
you
very
do
good
if you're a
advice.
runner.
It's
Yeah.
very good advice.
Yeah.
If only they would listen. Just a good testament of parenting.
I was going to say, are there times that you, besides the frontal lobe and running metaphor, bring in sort of the research and science when you're having conversations with them?
Sometimes, I mean, I with sleep, we do a lot of that. So sleep is actually, I think sleep is a great place for like science with your kids because it's super interesting. Like all animals sleep, including like mammals that live in the ocean. Like a dolphin sleeps half of its brain at a time.
So
While they're like,
interesting.
they have like half it down. Anyway, that's like a very, kids like that stuff.
Yeah.
And sleep is a place where you can very rapidly see the impacts. So if your kid is like up super late, like one night for some other reason, they're very tired the next day. And so it like is really, really reinforcing.
Right.
And we know a lot about the science. So that's one where I'm like we've like gone hard into
And they're receptive.
sleep, and they're receptive. Actually, one time my daughter still likes to bring up. One time, I let her have a caffeinated tea by accident. I did not know it was caffeinated when she was like 8, like at 4:30 in the afternoon, and she like couldn't go to sleep until like, I don't know, 2:00 in the morning
Oh
or
my
something. And like the
God.
next day, like it was a terrible death. She'll still bring it up. Like, remember that time you made me do that? But it was I think it was one of my best decisions, because now my kids are always like, does this have caffeine in it?
Right.
I'm
Oh
just
my
like,
God.
no,
Right. Like
no.
it's memorable.
It was very memorable.
Oh my, well, on this note of sleep, we've talked a little bit, before this that, I lean so hard into things like this that I co-founded a company that our first product is a visual routine board, because I feel so strongly about not just sticking with a routine for routine's sake, but including our kids. I just
Totally.
realized early on,
Yes.
maybe it was because all kids are like this, but I realized early on when they were 2 and like infancy that during COVID, I was like, I need pictures to show them like the order. Like I just felt like a drill sergeant,
Yeah.
even when they were so young. And now as they've gotten older and we use our visual routine board, there's so many like questions around it. Like, why is snack on there, mommy? Like you always tell us that when we're hungry, we can eat. And that's true. I have snacks that I'm
Sure.
fine with them taking at any time. Sometimes it becomes unhinged. And then I will say, or it's like late at night and I'll say
Right.
something like, kitchen's closed or there's no snack. And she's
Yeah.
like, but basically it's a source of learning, I feel, around where we can't just stick something on a routine
Right.
board. How have you felt about routines early on and
Yeah,
the benefit of them or where you need to flex?
I love a routine.
I would think you would.
Love
because
a
you're-
routine. I mean, I think there are places where the routine is very helpful. I think, bedtime being for me like the most salient one. I think we started a bedtime routine with our kids like on day 4, basically like, and actually when I had probably we were less structured with the first kid. When we came home with the second kid, it was just like, we have this routine. We're also doing that. He's going to be up a lot in the middle of the night, but like, we're going to pretend
Right.
we're on a routine.
For routine's
We're going to
sake.
do we're going to do whatever, like a bed. We're going to read him a book. I think I was reading my son books at like 4 days. I was just
It's
like, this is the time for the book on the routine.
Right.
And I think having that, kids really value consistency. They like to know what to expect. And that doesn't mean that you never move outside of the routine or are flexible or whatever, but sort of knowing what to expect and being able to sort of visualize and is particularly at bedtime, if you like want your kid to go to sleep, this is like the most evidence-based piece of it, is like have a bedtime routine, because then when you need to do hard things like sleep train or, take them back to the room a million times in the middle of the night, you have that beginning where you're like, this is the routine. We all know what to expect, and then we can build other stuff on top of it. But our family is like, hyper routine based.
Were you always?
My husband
Before
and I,
kids?
pretty, like we definitely got like more structured after kids, but yeah, we're pretty like,
Just by
we're like
nature.
pretty routine based. I mean, to the point like we can't, like my kids are now old enough that like they go away to sleepaway camp, both of them at the same time. Like so last summer was like our first time. We had like 2 weeks, just the two of us. And I asked my husband, I was like, do you want to do something like a little different? And he was like, I think we should, like, maybe we could have fish for dinner, like, one additional time. That was the only thing he could think of. And so we, like, had the same routine. Like, we got up at the same time. We ate dinner at 6. Like, we just, it's like, that's it. Like, we cannot break out of this routine. Like,
I mean, I love that. That it clearly does stuff
we like
for
it.
you guys. Right.
It totally. It wasn't, I mean, it was a good realization that we're actually not doing this because, like, this is what's working for us. Like, the only thing we don't like is our kids don't like fish as much as we do, and we'd like to have it one additional time.
Right. And I'm smiling because even in the beginning when you said you read books from day one, and I was like, it's more for us. And I often say with, the routine board, I'm like, it's for the kids, but it's really for us. Like, I also love to be sort of like blame the board sometimes and say like, this is
this is like, but this is a lesson from teaching. This is what it's like to teach undergrads here. People are like, well, can I hand this in late? And it's like, I'm so sorry. The syllabus says there are no extensions. And then people are like, oh, you're right. Like, I wrote the syllabus. I'm 100% in charge of the syllabus. I can do anything I want. But when you're like, I'm sorry, it's on this.
It takes us out of it, right?
Like, okay.
And people are more receptive, including our kids. Like when it's less of, because there's also that power struggle too that you can sometimes get into, right? When it's like this third party, so to speak. But I heard you say research around routines. And just because why I love routines is because I worked with infants and toddlers in daycare settings and classrooms and saw routines. That's my evidence.
Yep.
But I'd love to hear from you more of like the science. Of course, I know a little bit. Of course, I studied this, early childhood, but just from your kind of
Yeah.
objective
I mean,
view.
we have a lot of, I think that the sort of strongest piece of this evidence really comes from like sort of behavioral modification
Yeah.
stuff. And there, like if you took one thing away, it's like consistency. And I think of consistency and routine as being kind of effectively the same
Totally.
thing, having kids know what to expect when they have done something wrong, when they have not something like what,
Yeah.
like that is a thing we see in the data, improves family
Yes.
functioning, improves kids' happiness. There's a reason that any early childhood setting you look at is
Has
going
it.
to be structured around these routines, and it's because that is how you get kids
Right,
to do
the
things
behavior.
and to behave. That's how you get good behavior, and the good behavior isn't the only thing we're going for, but it is the basis on which we build our ability to then have our kids sleep and sit down with us at the table
Totally.
and have these sort of positive interactions. Like I think we sometimes get confused with sort of good behavior and think about it as just kind of an end to itself. But I
Right.
actually think really it's an end to like being able to connect.
Yeah.
If you're constantly dealing with, discipline and dealing with behavior stuff,
Right.
you don't have the time to connect. You get the consistency stuff and you get some
It
routine
opens
in.
up space.
It opens up space to do other things.
Yeah. It also is sort of helps kids make sense of things. It giving age appropriate choices or being able to know how I get from A to B. You don't just wake up and then get to the door. What are the steps involved? There's so many different things that give them sort of the platform to behave better because they feel more included. Did you ever feel like there were behavior things that you didn't know how to kind of tackle? Putting routines aside, that you felt like,
Sure.
I mean, I'm sure there are, but any that stand out that you feel like you're like, I need to do more research on this?
I think the most challenging thing for us was, I have two kids, and my first kid was very well behaved isn't quite the right word, but like was she wasn't like a tantrumer, She just she
Yes.
was like very logical. She is like
Yeah.
very logical, and my second kid was not like that. And I remember really like having someone be like, "What is it broken?" Like, why is it not like the other one? And so
Right.
we actually spent sort of way more time with the second kid thinking about. I think this is a good lesson because you do get into a routine with the first kid, with
Right.
one kid, but then sometimes things come up. You're like, actually, whatever routine we had there, whatever like approach we had to this is
Every
not
kid's
working.
different,
Every
yeah.
kid is different, and we need to sort of think about modifying. And there are a lot of places there where I think having a structure to come back and kind of revisit, what's it like, what's the way we want to structure the routine, and how much do we want to involve our kids? I mean, I guess that's another piece of it that I think is really interesting is the question
Yes.
of like, when do you start not only giving kids autonomy, like to the extent you can within the routine, like letting them choose their socks, but like what's the point in which you actually want to engage your kids with deciding like how should the day run,
Totally.
and I think how do you build that up sort of little by little?
Right. And not just, I'm actually really thinking about that a lot. My 7-year-old is sort of like this like tween and, pushing back and not in a, negative behavior way, just a lot of, she's the logical one. So a lot of just like talking. Like this morning we sat in the car and she's like, can we have gum? And I'm like, no. And
Oh.
instead of just no, she was just like, why? Like, what is it about gum? And we got into a conversation actually about aspartame.
Great. Just what one wants in the
It was
morning.
like she was so receptive to it, but I'm just thinking about like what that looks like for her so much later on. So it just concerns me a little bit that my 7-year-old, who
Yeah.
is the more logical one, what that looks like later
I
on.
hear about it.
Yeah, there's benefits to the logical and the emotional. But speaking of morning routines, I have been just struggling a lot with the whole thing out there around hurried child syndrome.
Mhm.
And I loved that you covered it. And I want, without me kind of botching the whole thing, what's your perspective on this new kind of trending?
Made up trending thing, yes. So when people started talking about hurried child syndrome, they gave online the impression that this was a thing you could give your kid if you like rushed them out the door too much, Like you told them to get their shoes on too quickly, then they might have a lifetime of anxiety.
Oh my God.
Right? That was basically that was a message. Like, and it is like so many of these messages we give parents, which is like every moment is an opportunity to mess up your kid forever. It could be that
Totally.
one morning that you
Oh
told
my
them to get their boots on. That's it.
Right.
Forever.
Oh,
Right? So
it's
first
my
of all, kids are not like that.
Right.
The particular issue, sort of, there is a thing called hurried child syndrome, and it is this idea that like we are encouraging our kids to grow up too fast and like engaging them in too many pre-professional sports and doing a bunch of things that like encourage sort of adulthood earlier. And it's a phrase that came up in the 80s. It sort of keeps coming up. It has nothing to do with hurrying in the kind of like day-to-day sense. It's this sort of broader issue, which I think is an interesting issue to consider. You know, I think many people do probably do more pre-professional sports that make them happy, whether it's bad for
Right.
their kids or not. That's a totally different question than whether you should encourage your kids to put your shoes on. It's just not related.
I know, it's
like
mind-blowing.
It's like this is a name for one thing, which people have taken to mean a different thing, which means, and in fact, there is no evidence that hurrying your kid out the door
creates anxiety.
Or does anything other than, sometimes it doesn't work. But like for me, this was such a clear example of how sort of social media takes a thing, and then people click on it, of course, because of course I'm going to click on to find out all the ways I've ruined my child, and I think people have. Yeah, there are. It's not as easy to. It's not as easy to ruin your kid
Right.
as might be implied by Instagram, basically.
Yes. And also just the fact that like we've always had to hurry to certain things.
Yes,
for
you
years.
have to get to stuff.
Right.
You have to get to stuff, and I think there's also this piece of it where people get like the impression that that everything should always be about like serving the kid in all moments, and the like reality is like sometimes you're serving the family, and the fact that you need to get to work is actually also a value.
Totally.
It's also a value.
And I will admit that it actually tripped me up a little bit, less about the title, but just knowing my tendency to be always going before I even knew that there was a term for it, and knowing working in early childhood, like, there are times where I can not be going, and that's different than me being like, I've asked you guys 3 times now to put on your shoes. We have to go,
Yeah.
And also talking about what happens when they are late, and not overkill. Just there are times my logical one will be like, why do we have to rush? And I'm like, well, you're the one that also doesn't love walking in when you'll say, am I missing morning meeting?
Yeah.
These are those times where we can fit in, the tasks we need to do.
Yeah, we had a whole like morning situation for a while where like I was basically rushing the kids out. I was like trying very hard to get out the door at exactly some time, which already was going to have us be very early because our family is neurotic. And I realized at some point like we can actually make this a better experience for people if I like let up a little bit, if we all like let up a little bit on this. Not because I'm generating anxiety, just because it will make the morning a more pleasant experience. And then, of course, it turned out my kids were basically like, but we're not going to be there at the right. I was like, okay, well, if that's important to you, like, let's make sure that we are, brushing our teeth. We're not spending so much time on our hair.
Right. Right. Yeah, you realize it became a value for them. But what made you feel that you wanted to kind of shift a little bit there?
I didn't. It meant that the moments I had with them in the morning were not fun. And I think that was I think that in some ways, like that's the thing I wish people would think about. It's not that I was worried I was ruining them or I was worried I was like messing them up. It was just like, I don't get that much time with my kids, and I wanted the morning to be like more fun.
Right.
And the thing that was going to make it more fun was not saying like, why aren't we out the door? And this was when they were a little older, so it was like, well within their control to be out the door at this time. But to just backing it off a little bit and letting them come to that. In the end, we basically get out the door at about the same time, and everybody is happy with each other.
Right. But
And
less
that's all
of
I
you
want.
feeling like sort of what we were saying before, like dictating and like,
Exactly.
yeah. I heard you say because you're neurotic about time. It's interesting. I didn't know that about you, but could have maybe assumed with what you do. Anyway, I'm glad that I got here a little bit early today for the first time in my life. But is there anything in your own, were you always like that?
Yes.
From the start? Like you always remember being like that?
Yes.
Is it that when you're not on time, it's just you hate it?
I don't like it.
Right.
It makes me anxious. It makes
sort
me
of your
like,
own evidence base.
yeah,
That is
it's
not
just
for
like,
me.
that's not for me. Not being on time is not for me. I'm like, I like to be at the airport 2 hours in advance, like, I like
And
to
you
be.
married someone like that.
He's like a little less, but basically, yes. Like, I mean, I am the most anxious flyer person about the time at the airport. But, I married someone who is willing to accommodate my
And growing up,
needs.
your family was always on time.
Yes.
I
Yes.
just find such a linear thing there, which does mean that there is a little bit of onus on us, with this
Yeah.
area. Like, my family was not like that. I'm
Ah.
not like that. Matt's family is, my husband. And so that is like a big thing, right? Like, of meeting in the middle or just always arguing.
It's like,
But we've met in the middle. But this brings up something that since I heard you speak 2 years ago about, you don't go to birthday parties, or you do. I want you to explain it,
yes.
but I heard you
Okay.
speak about how you guys have decided as a family, or you and your husband, about not going to every birthday party. I don't want to botch it because I know what you meant and I want to give you an opportunity, but also the alignment with your spouse.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So just to be clear, our kids do go to some birthday parties, but what I said at that time, I saw you a couple years ago, and I have said subsequently is, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we can have time together as a family. Like, that is a sort of core value.
Yes.
And my husband and I both work full time. He commutes. We have some time with the kids during the week, but like the weekends are a lot of the time. And at some point we sat down and said, okay, like, how can we make sure we get time together on the weekends? And so on Sunday mornings, we hold a time in the calendar called family activity. And we try to do something together as a family. And by holding that time, it does mean things come up, sometimes birthday parties or other things, which we don't do because we are holding that time.
Right.
Now, if somebody like had their wedding, or it was like somebody's
course.
best friend's birthday party on Sunday morning, like, of course, these routines are made to be more
Yes.
flexible. But we have found that if we sort of let an infinite amount of flexibility in there, that it's easy for that to
unravels.
just never happen.
Right.
Right. And if we just said, well, let's try to find time every weekend to be together as a family, like, very rapidly, that would not happen. And so for us, kind of putting it in the like saying, like, this is the time.
Yeah.
And then, of course, my kids get like very into it. And like, so we end up doing fun stuff. But this is a piece where the value of sort of talking to your partner, I think, is very high, because if you are married to someone where you guys are aligned and you both think like this is very important, great. Then you have an opportunity to like put it down on the calendar
Right.
and say, if you're not aligned in that, it's much better to have that conflict upfront on purpose than to have it every weekend when your weekend doesn't look like you want, or it doesn't look like he wants, or and I think that kind of like surfacing of disagreements on purpose so you can compromise on them is an undervalued part of like managing a relationship with kids.
Absolutely. Yeah. We did not have that conversation up front when it came to like being on time and stuff like that. And to me it was, so we muscled through a lot of that, even like before kids.
Yeah.
And I think when there's stuff like that, when you feel so strongly about a certain way, to me it's sort of this area of, I'm not okay. I know it's the title of the podcast, but I wanted my husband, that to me is the value. Like, I want him to know what it comes from, and I wanted to know where mine comes from. And it wasn't a therapy session, but finally I was just like, what do you feel like would be worst case scenario if we're an hour early versus 2? And I'm sure you've asked yourself this because it's probably the way you think with airports. And he realized it was more for him about like just the way he was sort of trained, for lack of a better term, in his upbringing. And for me, he was like, but what's the matter with you getting there 2 hours early? I'll say, but for me, it's sacrificing other things, and maybe that's me needing to be better with like executive functioning way before. But we both learned. And I think that's a key piece of having also these conversations.
Totally. I think asking like, why do you feel, if there's something where we both feel very strongly,
and you're just like muscling.
and it's like, there's like, it's like, why do you feel like that? And Like, sometimes that's unresolvable. I mean, I think the
Right.
hardest question people ask me about is like, I want to have another kid and my partner doesn't, or vice versa. It's like, there's
What
no
do you
secret option C. Like, it's either you do the thing you want or you do the thing that they want. There's no like half a kid. You know, there's no like meeting in the
Right.
middle. And
Oh,
that's,
you're not suggesting go do. You're just saying this is like what it is.
this
Right.
is what it is. Like, you sort of, you need to talk about it. It's like important to talk about it, but it's not a thing that can be compromised on.
Right.
But
Totally.
many of the conflicts that we have, you know, how much family dinner should we have? How much, like, just people have to take a bath every night? Like, whatever the things you feel strongly about, a lot of times there is some sort of compromise
Right.
in the middle. And asking, like, why do you think, like, what
Yeah.
is it that you're worried is going to happen if my kid doesn't take a bath every night? Like,
Right. Knowing what's behind it has always helped me also have more empathy for things that I feel like
Totally.
my husband's just like rigid about. And I think for kids too, like taking a second to realize what's behind behavior, I think in general for humans.
Yes, it's very important.
There is something else that I wanted to ask you before, I just take advantage of my time with you.
Amazing.
If you could leave anyone with, I know the term is like, what parenting hill would you die on? Which, like, to me, I was like, I don't really love that term, but I guess that's what it is. What do you feel so strongly about in terms of what you've put out into the world in the parenting space that's sort of like non-negotiable? I know that's huge. For young kids, let's say, since
For
that's
little
where
kids,
mostly
yeah.
where my listeners are. Even when it was like not trending or what everyone else was doing or whatever. Like, what did you feel strongly about that you could remember?
I honestly, I think the message I would want people to have is like, there is nothing like that. There is no like live, like die on this hill thing.
That's why I don't love that.
If there's some things that are super important for little kids, having a stable place to live, having enough to eat, having someone who loves them, occasionally hearing some books, like some stuff that I suspect basically everyone listening to this podcast is doing. And then all the other stuff, it's like dealer's choice. You like think about the choices you're going to make and the ones that are going to make you happy, but there's not some decision you're going to make that's going to like ruin your kid or make your kid a wizard. Like there's just like, it's just not like that.
Right.
And I think people spend too much time on like, what's the choice that's going to optimize my kid, and not enough time on what's the choice that's going to make us happy. And I would draw that distinction because sometimes it's like, well, people are spending too much time thinking about their parenting. I mean, as a person who writes about parenting, I don't think that, but I do think that if we sort of spend that parenting thinking time on like how to optimize our kid, that's not as helpful as spending that deliberate time thinking about like how to make our family happy and like work well together. And that's where I want people to spend their parenting time.
I love that. And it's sort of kind of amazing that I don't usually ask this question. I don't know what made me ask it for you, but it's sort of what you do for the world is,
I hope.
yeah, you have given people that freedom to know that there's not just some magic answer to each thing. Even in your own parenting, as neurotic as you say you are about certain things, it's because it's what makes you happy. It's not like, oh, the research said I have to be 2 hours early and like that's what builds more serotonin and makes you a better parent. Yeah. Like it's just
my husband, we do things on the weekend. My husband puts calendar invites in with like the directions. He's like, here's our drive time.
That helps him.
That's insane. But it helps him. It's like the thing that makes him happy and like comfortable. And like, okay, you gotta like do you. It's not because the data says it's important that there be a drive time calendar invite, but like that's what makes him happy with the family. That's it.
And it's really what you've done for me and so many other people is, just not put information out into the world to say this is what should be. But you've even said in many topics, like what outweighs what, right?
Yeah. Cost and benefits.
And like mental health and all of that is usually always wrapped in there. And I just fully appreciate that so much. I know you mentioned the books that you've written, but can you mention them again with a little bit of what each one is so people can keep it straight?
So Expecting Better is about pregnancy. Cribsheet is about early childhood, like 0 to 3. Family Firm is about parenting older kids and a lot about kind of family decision-making. And then The Unexpected is about complicated pregnancy after complications. And I will take an opportunity to say that parentdata.org is our website where we have all of those topics and where you can search for exactly the question that you have. and where we have a lot more like very deep dives into things that either didn't make it in the book or are in the book. Now we have more details or have come up since the books
Yeah,
came out.
'cause it's
So
evolving. Thank you so much for being on,
thank you.
for sharing openly, and just making us all feel a little bit more sane with research-backed reasoning for why everything's probably okay.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening.